Welcome to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's show brought to you by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. We're on the internets and social medias at Savage World or SWGM Podcast on Twitter and Facebook. If you like what we do, want to back the show, throw us a buck on Patreon, patreon.com/SWGM Podcast. And check us out on Twitter. Or not, Check us out on YouTube. Like, subscribe, and share. YouTube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. Same moniker on iTunes, Savage Worlds GM Podcast. And if you are watching the live stream, feel free to comment. We do bring those comments into the show. Tonight's topic, modern times. Talking about gaming in a modern era and modern setting. And here to discuss it, Dave, the rules maven Scott.
I promise you, Harrison Hunt, this is still the GM Hangout. We've just rebranded.
And Dustin, the Savage Zealot Smith.
He's lying. We've all been replaced by Doom bots.
And a report on Chris the Savage Mommy Fox. He's on the loose somewhere in the Denver, Colorado area. The police have issued a standing all points bulletin. He appears to be revisiting some deep secret place in the forest. We don't know where he's at.
Do not engage. Please do not engage.
In all seriousness, our thoughts do go out to Chris and his family as they mourn the loss of the fan.
We do.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the perils of gaming in a modern setting. If you're a GM and you decide, hey, you know what? I'm going to set this in current day and time. Boy, have you just picked up a huge mule horse for your work. Oh my God, you're going to be busy. So, not saying that it can't be done, but you're a brave soul if you decide to do it. So let's talk about some of the pitfalls to modern gaming.
So I'm just going to throw one of these out here real quick because it was literally the very first thing I ran into when running ETU was all of a sudden I had players who were buying things that they searched on Amazon to find, and they wanted to pay the prices they found on Amazon for these items, even if the item was listed in the ETU book for a specific price.
And then what about encumbrance? How much does that thing weigh? How do we do that?
So, I mean, the biggest thing I think to take away from that particular topic is that just because something has statistics that you can readily Google check to look up does not necessarily mean that's going to line up with the statistics that we have in the role-playing setting. And I mean, the simple way you can do this is just take a look at like the difference between an actual set of medieval plate armor and what it weighs versus what the encumbrance in the book for a medieval set of plate armor is. Like, there's some authentic museum pieces out there that are true period pieces, worn with gambeson, the whole 9 yards, and I guarantee you they weigh more than they do in the book.
Yep.
So if they're going to look up things on Amazon.com and they're going to we're going to go with the whole issue of encumbrance. Do you ever get the urge to make them apply for their concealed carry permit?
Well, I mean, ETU actually has the CCW rules in it.
Right.
There's a way for a character to apply for a CCW in that setting. It's built in as a setting, as not necessarily a setting rule, but kind of, this is the reality of being in East Texas on a college campus. Like, they've got the rules of what weapons can and can't be carried on the actual campus property and things like that. So, I mean, I think there's something to be said about applying real world realities to these things. When your players decide to engage with it. But I think you have to take that step back and think, just because we're playing in modern day, what's our actual setting? If your setting is a little more fantasy oriented, where You're going to be doing whether it's crime fantasy where all the player characters are buying everything through a black market fixer that their connections to organized crime put them in contact with. Well, then no, they're not going to pay Walmart or Amazon prices. They're going to pay black market prices. And they're going to have to make a streetwise check to find the guy to sell it. If they want to buy it through Amazon, that's all well and good, but that gun comes with serial numbers, and as soon as you shoot somebody with it, you've left behind forensic evidence. So there's an aspect of that. There's also just that aspect of how much realism do you want in the game. Like, you might be playing in a game where you don't care how much a minigun weighs. That absolutely the big heavy bruiser can carry around a minigun with them. In that case, no, you don't want to go Google checking how much a minigun weighs and then compare that to the max load for the character based on their strength. It just isn't going to work out well for you.
Well, I think the other thing too is looking at the overall internet communications when it comes to them being able to find things. I'll just Google it. As a GM, how do you contend? Do you contend with that? How do you contend with that?
Oh, it's an investigation role,
right?
But
I mean, towards your like major plot points and stuff. Like,
oh, I don't care. It's an investigation role, and you know what? If I have a plot point that can be undone with a Wikipedia search, I'm a bad game master. I'm just throwing it out there.
I'm just gonna say that depending on the type of setting, because if we're doing like some kind of, if you're like, I don't know, looking up surveillance and bomb, NSA Steve is probably going to come knocking on your door and be like, hey, we noticed your search history. But if you're like a Lovecraftian horror mystery and you start looking that, there's a chance your phone might come to life and try to eat you. Just keep that in mind.
Well, I mean, and the greatest part of that is you run into some of like the great setting rules that they put into ETU for things like your character just has a really bad time with tech. And then you have the guy who's sitting in the corner trying to look shit up and your character bumps into him. And all of a sudden that cell phone just got bricked. Or, the one that we had in our actual play where it's, hey Siri, how do you defeat an elder demon? And the investigation roll is a flop. So you go, places selling spicy food in your area are, and you list off 3 restaurant names.
Right. Thai restaurants in your area. Yeah.
And you're like, hey Siri, what is love? And she's like, please don't hurt me.
So I think there's a lot of things that you can play with in that regard to bring reality into the game and let your players use their ideas of the modern world to really kind of restructure things. And to a certain extent, some of this is going to reduce the number of dice rolls. And what I'm saying here is, if your players are playing in a medieval fantasy setting, they don't know how to shoe a horse, but their character might know how to shoe a horse, so they're going to make a knowledge roll to figure that out. But in a modern setting, it's pretty much assumed the character knows how to fill a gas tank because, well, you know how to fill a gas tank, and every person over the age of about 15 knows how to fill a gas tank that lives in the United States. So I think you have to, again, pay attention to kind of those common knowledge changes, but also just reduce the sheer number of dice rolls of trying to access information that the characters would naturally have, that the players are going to know they would naturally have. You're not going to get that pushback when you call for a knowledge roll to mix together home chemicals to create a pipe bomb, because most of your players at the table don't know how to do it without a Google search to look it up first.
Right. Now, that brings up an interesting point, though, Dave. There are certain strengths that you would have in a fantasy setting that would be weaknesses in a modern setting. For example, in a fantasy setting, nobody loses their mind when the power goes out.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a major plot point a lot of times when we lose our modern conveniences. Certain things like in a fantasy setting, you don't ever have to worry about running out of gas. You know, it's just a matter of like, okay, well, the horses died or got spooked. Now we walk. But in a modern setting, you're like, how far do we walk? Are we going to be exhausted by the time we get there?
Oh yeah, you are not the robust adventurers from days of yore that walked everywhere anymore. You're a bunch of college students who walking across campus is a chore.
Right. Or you make an investigation roll and download Uber to your phone app and call an Uber, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we've touched on some of this stuff with the Friday Night Dead End game, where we have to deal with how far can you get on an average tank of gas, how much mobility does that give you when you're having to weave through traffic, or you're trying to dodge the hordes of the undead. And it's a little different, but it's still the same kind of a hurdle you're going to face. Like, okay, well, so the player characters have access to a vehicle, so they can get from wherever they are to downtown fairly easily. But how long does that take? Is this downtown Chicago, downtown LA, downtown New York, where it can be 2 hours to go what it would take you 20 minutes to walk just because of traffic and the way the route is laid out. Whereas you could just cut across town, you go from one side of Manhattan to the other in much less time walking than you're ever going to do it by car. And how much gas are you going to burn going up and down the streets trying to get to where you're going? Because, I mean, you also run into things like one-way streets. There's a lot of those things that, to a certain extent, as a GM, you can hand wave by simply saying, and 20 minutes later you arrive. But it can also become, oh, look, now we've got this new thing. Run a dramatic task to see if you can get there in a shorter period of time. The clock is ticking. You've got a half hour to get downtown. Oh, look, you failed the dramatic task. You're stuck in a traffic jam. You're not going to make it. What do you do?
Right.
It's not that you failed to get there in time, but the vehicle's not going to get you there in time. So maybe you have to park on the side of the road and then walk the rest of the way because you failed that dramatic task. It introduces new challenges you can set in front of the players because of it.
Right. Well, and also, too, we're talking about verisimilitude, right? So it also depends on what you're running. If I'm running Savage Worlds, a version of the Expendables, all bets are off, right? I mean, I don't necessarily care about realism because that's not what the game's about, right?
And that goes back to what I had said earlier about knowing your setting. Just because your setting is set in the modern world doesn't mean it's necessarily the real world.
Right.
Right. So let's talk about this. Well, so for example, let's say I'm going to run a classic Ghostbusters game. Well, guess what wasn't around in 1984?
The internet.
A little thing called the internet, or cell phones, really, for that matter, unless they were huge bricks and they were car phones with limited range and expensive as all hell. So how do you do research? Well, you've got to go to a library. You got to find books. You got to do it that way. There's some modern conveniences. You got, vehicles, but at the same time, you're also dealing with this incredible, crazy, weird science tech of, ghost catching devices and proton packs and all that. So,
I want to take a step back from the Ghostbusters analogy and specifically talk about modern time. Are we talking about the 80s? Are we talking about the aughties? Are we talking about the 90s, the 70s? Are we talking about the 2020s? That 15 minutes in the future is still modern time gaming because you're literally talking about something that's going to happen in a couple of years. It's still modern time. It's not truly a future. We're not adding space lasers or a fully formed space force to deal with in your game. You're just talking about what's going to happen in the next 10 years.
Right.
If we get down to it, though, modern games are anything. They run the gambit from steampunk, Wild West, 20s, 30s, 40s, 70s to now, because the modern era would, if you take it slice of life, it's when we started developing the technology that caused us to jump. So
I'm going to disagree a little bit. I don't think that I would consider like Deadlands Noir or Deadlands Reloaded to be modern era gaming. I don't even know that I would consider Cthulhu in its classic sense set kind of, Cthulhu's kind of classically set in about the 30s and 40s. I don't know that I would consider that modern gaming. Those time periods to me, they are definitely there's a sense of that's in the past. Weird Wars Nam, what did they call that? The tour or tour of darkness. To me, that's not even modern. I mean, by all intents and purposes, I would say true modern has got to be within the last 30 years because it's the average lifespan of the people who are sitting at the table playing the game. Yeah, maybe if you've got a group that's playing that's in their 50s, you could reach back as far as the 70s. But really, I mean, even that is kind of a stretch. We all know that the world doesn't work the same way anymore. When you talk about modern, gaming, we're talking about games that are going to have to include things like the cell phone, like the internet, like, satellite communications that are going to have to deal with the fact that, we've got self-driving cars and green vehicles that can drive much further on a tank of gas, but also require, the ability to recharge so they don't do well in short start-stop traffic. There's a lot of things that go into that modern time period that I think you kind of lose when you start to expand that time period too large.
I would say you almost have to be, first of all, for the purpose of our discussion, I would say it almost has to be 21st century. I mean, we're almost 20 years into the 21st century. I mean, modern gaming has got to be the 21st century.
I mean, to a certain extent, I don't disagree. And I'm kind of saying 30 years because it's the average lifespan of the person who's sitting at the table. But I really do think modern has to mean something, and I think maybe that's a session zero conceit is talking about what time period you're playing in. I know when we did the late 70s, early 80s gangster game that we did not long ago, there were a lot of things that the players were referencing that only existed in that game because the players were old enough to remember that shit.
Right. Like rotary phones. Like, oh, God damn, I got done a rotary phone.
Rotary phones is kind of the given that you're going to have in a 70s game. But some of like the specific equipment that people were calling out, or I know like my character had the habit of always listening to the baseball game on the local AM radio whenever they were doing things, and then having the sports bets going on about that. Modern day, they just pull out their phone and watch the game because you can do that on Facebook Live now. So there's absolutely a difference in the way we handle the world that is very specific to that time period. And if you weren't alive then, you might not necessarily think of that difference.
So do vehicle chases really matter? Is there really a difference? And I'm going to kind of drop in on two because there's two things in here from Mark Brown that I kind of want to talk about. Vehicle chases and modern weapons. So I want to talk about this real quick. The vehicle rules by themselves are an abstraction of a chase. I mean, the chase rules by themselves are an abstraction. I don't see a modern game adding any more really to it than maybe, and even I wouldn't even say putting any negative modifiers on driving rules or any other rules. You just run the chase rules the way you run the chase rules.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to make any adaptation to it.
Rules even have right in them that when you're dealing with vehicles specifically, the top speed of the vehicles being different just applies a modifier to somebody's actual roll for the number of cards they're dealt, but it doesn't make any difference on any of the rest of it. So
you don't consider rough terrain either, right? Or smooth terrain, or a lot of traffic or heavy traffic, or not all that. It doesn't really factor into your rolls.
I think that's handled by the obstacle cards and things like that that can that come up. That's where, as a GM, this is a car chase, and you drew, the two of clubs. You just fishtailed and are headed towards a Jersey barrier.
Right.
Give me a roll not to hit that concrete pylon at full speed. Otherwise, you're facing collision damage. That is the way I can bring the terrain directly in conflict with the game, but using the abstract mechanic that's already there. But with that said, I think there's a certain level of being able to accept abstraction that I think becomes the bigger problem there. But that's a whole other show topic, right. Is how GMs have to adjust the way they run a game for abstraction.
Now, I would say this, though, from a meta level, as a GM, there's additional consequences to get involved in a chase in a modern era setting. Like, there's going to be news helicopters, police band radio. So you may run through that chase and run the chase rules, but the end of that chase may have additional story implications.
Maybe. And again, it goes back to our, the Expendables moment where we talked about, it all depends on how realistic you want the world to be. And some game worlds, you might not have a lot of, worry about the news watching you or a lot of cops showing up. I know ETU kind of has this loose rule that unless there's a lot of mayhem going on with the public, that the police show up after everything's turned to dust and there's no real evidence of the players having done anything wrong. Therefore, right. They kind of always skate just past the police.
Right. Or it could be a Die Hard style scenario where the news is just there for an added story element. Or, the chief of police is on a bullhorn screaming at you and it's more story and comedy than anything else, where it doesn't really have an impact. As far as weapons go, I know we've said this on the show before. It bears repeating. I'm going to say it again. Trappings. I don't care if it's a Sig Sauer. I don't care what particular type of modern firearm you're using. 12, 24, 48 range, 2d6 damage. Why? Because look at all the guns that are listed there with different names. They all have the same stat. As long as they're in the same, as long as they're in the same class, then they're the same stats as what you see there. Just feel free to tell your players, oh no, this is this very particular type of handgun, and here are the stats for this. Oh, hand them an equipment card with written out on it if that's important in your game. I think just fall back to the abstraction. Now, Dave brought up something very interesting in the green room about most role-playing games where melee damage is far more dastardly than weapons damage, and that's not really balanced in a modern setting.
Oh, yeah. The idea that my character can have a D12 strength wielding a two-handed sword that does D10 damage. I'm doing a D10 plus a D12 plus any additional modifiers from edges and whatnot in straight damage every time I hit you. If I shoot you with a pistol, I'm doing 2d6. I mean, folks, that's a pretty massive difference. That two-handed weapon is far and away more potent than any handgun. The problem is, in a modern setting, how do you bring a two-handed sword to bear, or a weapon of that type? Because, I mean, let's be honest, modern-day weapons, there are swords. There are, chainsaws, and, you pick up a chain, a bike chain and whip it at somebody. You can deal with, that's a flail. I mean, you can get a true modern equivalent of most of the weapons in the melee section on the chart. But, and this is a big aspect of it, the player has to be knowledgeable enough of how to use the mechanics of cover and whatnot to get to their target and close that range. And also as a GM, look, I know in the book it says the range on that gun is 48 inches. But quite honestly, most of your encounters are going to happen within about 4 inches. 4 inches is what, guys? We're
24
talking
feet.
4 feet?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
The average room. Stop and think about this. How big is your living room? How big is the cafeteria at the local, university or whatnot? You might have a room and a big cafeteria might be 120 feet across. That's not a lot in as far as inches. You're just over what, 16 inches at that point? Something like that. I mean, let's be real here. Everything's at short range for most of the ranged weapons, and much shorter than that in many cases. A hand grenade hits everyone in the scene. Why? Right. Because you don't have room to lay the large burst template over top of a bedroom or an office.
Right. Well, I think you can, there's some things that are already built in the Savage Worlds that you could bring into a modern setting to make handguns and ranged weapons a little bit more deadly. And I would just say apply gritty damage to any ranged weapon. Apply the gritty damage setting rule to any ranged weapon to give it a little extra oomph and kick.
You could, or you could go the other direction and just automatically, as a GM, start applying more cover penalties. You know, a player decides to pull out their weapon and unload it on the guy standing at the podium. Well, the podium offers at least medium cover because it covers 80% of their body. I mean, it covers up to, mid chest height. Whereas, if they're behind a desk, that's at least light cover. If as a GM, you don't even require that somebody in the room say they took cover, you just immediately start saying, well, there's a desk between the two of you. That's hard to shoot past light cover. And right there, you've just made a knife a much more useful object because I can walk around the desk and stab your ass. Right. Now, if you specifically say you're taking cover, I still receive the cover penalty from the knife. I want to be very clear. Melee weapons do not bypass cover.
Right.
Yep.
I would say that one of the big factors in that, outside of cover and outside of movement, is ammunition. It's reloading, because that's how you have to time something like that. You have to wait until the person is spent and they're about to reload if you're going to go in there. Because in all honesty, if we are talking like a real world scenario, you just don't mess with a gun. You either want to be too close or too far away.
Oh, I mean, that becomes a thing too.
Yeah.
Take a look at the rules. There's very few weapons that can actually be used at true close combat range. And again, if the room's only 12 foot wide, that's 2 inches.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's pace will get them across a 2-inch area to where they're in close range, and suddenly that rifle is absolutely useless as anything other than a club.
Yep, and that pistol has to beat your parry, so having a high fighting comes in very handy at that point.
Yeah, the idea that guns automatically win, well, not necessarily wrong. I mean, there's a reason that when the Cult Peacemaker came out, they called it the Equalizer.
Yeah.
There's a very big reason that moment in history made a huge difference in every combat that happened since. But at the same time, like, there's some pretty gritty realities to walking up and shoving a gun in somebody's face. And, it's all well and great in the movies when they walk up and they put the barrel of the shotgun directly to the side of the guy's head. But it's pretty freaking easy in game terms for them to just jerk their head 4 inches and you miss.
Right. I mean, in the movies, they kind of let the guy shoot them in the head in that moment. They do that bit, they close their eyes, there's a dramatic tension, there's the bang. Like nobody's just wiggling around to get out of there.
Well, easy. There's a reason that if you actually do some deep research for a modern setting or a crime setting, you'll find out most people are killed by a chest shot or a leg shot, and then once they're laying on the ground immobilized, they're finished off with the headshot.
Yeah.
There's gunshots are not typically fatal from the first wound. They're typically debilitating, and then a coup de grace is committed afterward.
I'm just going to tell you that most people, they think of like a leg shot because they've seen movies. They think that that's non-lethal and that's the peaceable way to go. No, you can bleed out after 2 minutes by getting shot in the leg. Getting shot anywhere in the body can and potentially will kill you if you don't get immediate medical treatment.
I don't know if I would go with will. I know a guy who got shot in the ass and it had no long-term effects other than the fact he's got a 22 round still in his hip.
But he did get medical treatment and he didn't bleed to death. That's what a lot of people don't consider is the blood loss. Yeah, trauma and shock, like Sunset Sam says, that's what really kills most people.
Like, holy shit, I can't believe I just got shot. Holy shit, I can't believe I just got shot. Holy shit, I can't believe I just got shot. I would say too, and Dustin touched on it too. I think if you're going to run any kind of modern setting, you're going to be dealing with firearms. You need to enforce players tracking ammo.
Yeah.
Hey, that clip holds 17 shots with the one in the chamber. How about we count that out? Oh, you're double tapping all over the place? Great.
Double tap, triple tap, automatic fire. These things chew through ammunition.
And beyond that, you also have to realize that if gunshots are going off, the police are going to be called, and they are not going to be happy.
At the very minimum, if you're playing any kind of a realistic setting, you're going to be dealing with a response time. And the average police department, at least in the United States and most of Europe, is well under 10 minutes. In many cases, it's under 5 minutes.
Right. So I would say, how many rounds do you think that would be?
5 minutes?
Yeah.
5 minutes is a lot of time.
That's a lot of ammo.
Right.
But it's not a lot of time for escape. But with that said, like, let's talk about something else here too for a moment. With this, is every pull of that trigger was 9 rounds of ammunition. You had to count out when you're going full auto, because the minimum full auto weapon is a rate of fire of 3. How quickly do you burn through that and then find yourself having to reload? And once you have to reload, that's another action your characters had to take. And then there's the action of whatever it is you're there to do, whether it's, taking the drugs off the guy. Well, that's an action to search to find it, and then an action to pick it up, put it away. You're talking a sequence of things that are going to chew up that time, whether it's the time to take to reload, whether it's the time to take search for the thing you're there to grab, whether it's the time to stow that in your own backpack or rucksack or whatnot, and then run out to your car and get the car started. Especially if you've got some of the, again, those hindrances we've talked about that can be applied to modern settings where maybe the vehicle doesn't start well, and then traffic and by the way, all this time you're also dealing with a group of civilians standing around who heard this gunshot. Are they calling the police? Are they taking a picture of you with a cell phone? Is there a security camera you had to disable? Are they in the way? Is there now a crowd that's formed that's in the way and cuts off one of your routes of escape? There's a lot to start to consider as a GM of different things you can throw in front of your players as challenges. And I'm not saying this because you should make it hard on your players, but it's just the reality of that world is, oh, look, a sword got stabbed into a guy in a bar. No one in the street heard that.
Right.
They might have heard a few screams in the bar from other patrons, but that's the extent of it. A machine gun going off is going to be heard for most of a block away, regardless of what's going on. It doesn't matter if they're watching TV, listening to the stereo, etc.
Well, and I'll say this too. The other thing to keep in mind is we're talking about this kind of from the idea that the players are bank robbers or they're on the other side of the law. You could absolutely be playing a group of characters that are part of a police, task force that are licensed and registered to carry firearms and discharge them in the course of their duty. I think an interesting thing to do in that situation, social conflicts for whether or not the shot was clean. If somebody dies, was it a clean shoot or was it not a clean shoot? Up, tribunal, police review board. Here comes INS, or here comes what do they call it? I'm completely blank because I've had a really long day.
Internal affairs.
Yeah, I want to say INS. I know that's not right, but internal affairs. Yeah, there's an internal affairs hearing on your shooting to see whether or not you get to keep your job and your gun.
If you discharge a firearm as a police officer and you don't have a logical, justified reason, they will have things to say to you.
Well, I mean, again, this comes down to how gritty do you want the game to be. Again, remember, if your players are playing the quote-unquote police officers, a officer-involved shooting is a minimum of a 2-week suspension with pay while they investigate the shooting.
Right.
Minimum. That's 2 weeks of in-game time that character is not involved in any police procedures. That doesn't mean they're not involved in the adventure, but they can't be involved in any police procedures.
That's right. So you lose that connection.
Right.
You lose your access to whatever you had at the station.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing a detective game, oh man, then you have a lot of police asking you some really tough questions.
Yeah, because now you're a private citizen that just discharged that firearm that you maybe don't even have the right to own, depending on the different, if you're talking about a game that's set in Chicago, LA, New York, private citizens don't have the right to just carry a gun openly.
Mm-hmm.
Most major cities have some pretty staunch gun rules and no-go zones for most firearms, most bladed weapons over a certain length. Like, there's a lot of things that you really have to take into consideration. All of a sudden, a broken beer bottle becomes kind of the common weapon of trope, I know, for like the 80s. But I think the reason we end up talking about this from the players are on the wrong side of the law standpoint is 9 times out of 10, the player characters aren't going to be public officials. The games just aren't as fun to play as a group of police officers because, again, you get bogged down in a lot of the procedural stuff that goes into that. But
you can still play.
You can repurpose some of the mechanics that Eric Lamoureux just released in his Wise Guys setting for stuff like that. Like, he's got this heat mechanic where he lays down a heat card in the middle of the table, and when there's 3 heat cards, you gain the wanted hindrance. And that shit doesn't go away. You now have become wanted because you've done so many things. Well, you could play that in reverse and have cards that, deal with, there's more procedures and you're more times having to being eaten up by paperwork. So your characters now have less and less time to complete the tasks that they're being sent out to do. Or you got to spend more time on foot patrol because you've been busted back down. You don't have as much time to go out and do these other things. You can absolutely take mechanics like that exist for kind of modern gaming and repurpose them to do different things. But I think you really have to consider, what is it you're trying to capture? Are your characters mercenaries in a war zone? Are they police in a modern city? Are they criminals in a modern city? Are they archaeologists? And you're playing an Indiana Jones-esque, pulp game set in the modern times, where all of a sudden you're dealing with, attack helicopters and jet fighters and, the Russian army looting, crypts in Syria or whatever. You can take an absolute through line to find ways to do those different story types in the modern setting, but there's going to be different things that happen. The big thing with Indiana Jones was always a plane that takes him somewhere. Well, now it's a jet instead of a prop plane. The fist fight on the rolling tank, probably not going to happen because you don't have the exposed treads on the modern main battle tank, and you probably don't want to be anywhere near one as a guy on foot.
Well, I'm saying this too. For example, you could do complete, we're Dirty Harry, or this is Lethal Weapon. We're loose cannon cops. And 9 times out of 10, we kill guys, and it's whatever. We killed them. But every once in a while, when you destroy, when you cause millions of dollars of damage to a public building, yeah, that's when the captain pulls you to his office and chews your ass out. And there can be a social conflict, and you can be busted down to foot patrol. You could lose your lieutenant badge and be dropped down a rank, or forced to retire. Hand over your pistol and your badge. You're on resignation, forced resignation. And then that just presents a story challenge to the players to continue investigating in that trope and genre of doing what they're doing, but now they're not officially police. I'm just saying it doesn't have to, you don't have to make it a goddamn police procedural every episode, every time they draw a weapon. But using the social conflict rules could be a great way to do that very simply in Savage Worlds.
Well, and I think that's one of the other interesting things with Eric's version for Wise Guys in the demo kit is he talks about he's going to release more actual setting rules for this later on. But in the demo kit, he basically says if your character gets pinched for a crime, that's the equivalent of incapacitation. That's character death. The character's going away to prison. They're out of the game. Roll up a new tune.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could also say this too. I mean, you could take advantage if you're playing that kind of game. Take a look at the Savage Worlds edges and hindrances that apply. And if you're playing a detective on the LAPD and that's one of your characters, you might have the connections edge for a confidential informant that knows what's going on the street when it comes to guns or drugs or whatever. But that's their one specialty, and that's your confidential informant. But even when you talk to him, you still have to bribe him. You still have to pay him off and pay him money to get the information. But I would just say, take a look at, you really have to kind of apply trappings and think of edges and hindrances with an open mind when you're taking a look at the Savage World settings, because so much of it is geared towards fantasy nomenclature and terminology.
We completely missed this when we brought it up at the top of the show, and I think we need to touch on it again. What about the economics of the game?
Right.
I think there's a decision you have to make as a GM going in. One, do you want to use like $1 in game is a real world dollar, and then your players can look up, what do they pay at Walmart or Amazon or whatnot? Can they special order items? And I think the answer in my case has always been absolutely, but at the same time, I'm either going to charge you a flat cost of living fee that comes out of whatever wage we determine your character make. Maybe your character makes $400 a week and your cost of living is $300 a week. So you actually only make $100 that you get to spend, because things like rent and food and all these things that we're not, I'm not going to role play out your characters going to the grocery store. I'm not going to role play out your character's paying rent to the landlord at the first of the month.
Well, it's Friday. We're not going to do a dramatic test to pay bills. What?
But at the same time, those are real considerations that as soon as you start down that path of $1 is $1, those things have to be calculated in and be taken away from what the characters gain in, quote unquote funds from things like the rich edge or from having a job that pays them a set wage.
Deadlands Noir enforces that everyone has the poverty hindrance. And I think that's great, because in reality, that's what you do. You buy food and shelter. Now, that's a very eloquent way to do it. If you play something like Interface Zero, they actually have a list of jobs where they have your cost of living and how much you make. So there's a little bit more math. It can be fun, but personally, I like the noir approach where it's, we just take half of what you make.
I agree. Well, if you're going to play something in a modern setting, I agree. You have to figure out what the economy is. It depends on what level of granularity you want. Are you going to track that? You're going to abstract it. What are you going to do with it? I agree. You have to kind of track it. It's like just as important as tracking ammunition in a gunfight.
To be fair, if you're not going to track it, if you're going to make it more abstract, something like Nemesis or Deadlands Noir have some elegant systems that handle that. I know that we've had mixed feelings on the Nemesis wealth system before as well. But I mean, they handle things like having a job and a lifestyle, and it covers how much does your character have to spend on a normal basis out of what they make, and having these abilities to earn more money that gives you some bonuses. But I mean, certainly that is something you want to take into consideration and then enforce it. Just because the book says you can get something for a set price, if you're going to use Walmart and Amazon and et cetera prices for most things, as a GM, you probably need to take the time to quickly Google search, Google shopping, every item the players want to buy, and just, maybe jot down, make a list of the common items that are available in the setting, and this is the price. Because as soon as you start down that path, you're going to start finding out that one thing in the book costs way more than it does in real life. Other things in the book cost way less. And you need to make sure that if you're going to go one direction or the other, you don't end up penalizing a player who is suddenly, I got screwed because they decided to do something. So you need to make that kind of a session zero rule as to, I didn't know to look up that price. Okay, but that's the prices we're using versus, this is the price in the book. Yeah, I know Walmart sells it for less, but this is the price in the book. That's the price you're going to pay.
Yeah. It's kind of a mixed bag. Once again, depends on your level of verisimilitude, how much you want it, but you have to, I would agree, you have to have some kind of economy in the game, whether you choose to abstract it. You can't just hand wave it in a modern setting. You shouldn't. Well, I say you can't. You shouldn't. You probably shouldn't. Because it should become an interesting thing. Like all of a sudden you got a character who's got the poverty hindrance. They're just barely making enough money to pay their rent and cover their expenses because they're bad with money. And then boom, that character getting a traffic ticket, a speeding ticket in the game is a huge obstacle to that character. Like, hey, listen, you got a $250 fine from the city for a speeding ticket. You don't have it. What are you going to do? I don't know. Hit up a buddy. All right, give me a persuasion roll. Nope. He says you still owe him for the last time that he lent you money. You haven't paid him back. Shit. What do? I don't know. Maybe got to pick up an extra job. And here's the thing. You can role play. You can apply that by very simply with mechanics going, okay, so you've picked up you're moonlighting. You're delivering pizza in your spare time. You're not getting enough sleep for the next 3 sessions. You've got a constant one level of fatigue. Because
start every session making a vigor roll to check to see if you have a level of fatigue. Right. There's a lot of different ways, and that's just a repurpose of, I want to say, the depression hindrance that is in one of the different settings. Where at the beginning of every session you make a spirit roll, and if you didn't roll high enough, you start with one fewer Benny for the night. You can repurpose and retrap those existing things and existing mechanics to kind of capture what happens to achieve these things. But it's absolutely something that I think your game isn't as good if you don't think about, am I going to even encounter encumbrance? Am I even going to encounter economy? And make those choices early on and then stick to them.
Right. But the point being, too, that you don't need a complicated point by point new setting rule or system for how you track money in the game. You can do it narratively as well with the example we just used. Like, shit, you owe this guy money, you're picking up spare jobs, you're dragging ass. Give me a vigor roll. You're not sleeping at night, man. You're out hustling 6 hours a night when you should be at home sleeping. You're working on like 4 hours of sleep. Go ahead and give me a vigor roll to see if you got a level of fatigue this session. I think the other thing that bears conversation real quick is healing in a modern setting. You got hospitals, you got all kinds of things. Do you extend the golden hour? Do you not extend the golden hour? Do you run the rules, rules as written?
So my personal response to that, or the rules official response to it? Because my personal is a little.
Let's hear both. The official rule is
the golden hour applies when the golden hour applies. There is nothing that says that modern healing methods are so good that the golden hour doesn't apply. In fact, the golden hour was a creation based on research that Peg did on the way actual doctors talk about how quickly they get a victim brought into the ER determines how much they can do to save that person. So the golden hour is rooted in modern science. In all reality, it's probably not. It's more likely to say the golden hour only applies to modern medicine and historic medicine, not so much.
Right.
But with that said, that's kind of where the rules as written apply. And I think Clint has even gone so far as to say that on a case-by-case basis, you can determine whether or not things like surgery can undo permanent injuries and things of that nature. That's more a question for the GM for the individual setting. Myself personally, the way I look at this is the golden hour applies to first aid, and that is I grab a first aid kit at the scene of the crime or accident or whatnot, and I'm applying bandages, a tourniquet, things of that nature to give instantaneous healing in that moment. As soon as we start talking about a hospital is automatically the heal power. You're already dealing with something that is technologically advanced, and we're talking about an item that has the abilities of a power at that point. And then surgery is greater healing. It takes you to you can way extend that, and you can really kind of go after some things that you wouldn't normally be able to do because of the ability to be rushed into a surgical room. With that said, and this is where this gets a little sticky, is I also typically am going to wrap a price around that I'm going to hit the player with later, because modern medicine isn't cheap.
It is not.
And I mean, you hear this debate a lot about, different places. And I mean, even in places that have more socialized medicine, there's still a payment that's made for that service. It might be far less than what we might expect here in the United States, but you're still making an out-of-pocket expense. It's just more in line with like what you would pay if you had really good health insurance here in the States. It would be more in line with what your deductible would be rather than the full cost of the procedure. But also in those cases, I might not say that you have the availability to have, a better than normal healing, because, well, they're going to put you on a wait list and it might be 5 weeks before they can get you in to take care of something, depending on how immediately life-threatening the wound is.
Right. And then if you're playing in a criminal setting, in a modern setting, you don't go to a hospital for a gunshot wound, because that stuff gets automatically reported to the police. So now what do? Oh, God, I got to go see this vet, or I got to go do a streetwise roll to find this doctor. And maybe I added an additional -1 penalty to the healing roll for the wounds, because
I love this. We had the player characters drag the wounded man to the vet in our Mafia game, and the vet's shooting the guy up with horse tranquilizers and all kinds of stuff. Like, that was a great scene, but absolutely you are not getting top-notch medical assistance.
Right. And I think we ended up saying it added another -1 total to the healing roll that you're making with the wounds. Yeah.
The guy comes out strung out on ether, and you have to make a fear check.
Like, what is that you're injecting? Ketamine? What?
It's fine. If it's good enough for elephants, it's good enough for you.
And Sunset Sam brings up, whether or not we're talking realistic versus modern. And again, this is where you have to make that decision. I mean, in your game, is modern medicine considered a weird science device, or is modern medicine considered a healing roll that, if it fails, still relegates the player to, a natural healing roll in a week? If you're playing a game where you want more realism, you're going to stick closer to core rules, and you're making a natural healing roll a week later for that broken arm, because the doctor was able to put it in a cast, but that doesn't necessarily do any kind of immediate healing for that thing. You know, that just is the way that works if you're playing a more realistic game. Whereas if you're playing a more, less verisimilitude, more cinematic game, oh, absolutely, it's the heal power every time the doctor touches you. Yeah. Take these 2 pills and give me a heal power roll.
Well, also too, and this is the thing that bears repeating. I think a lot of GMs don't want to be kind of see healing the rules in Savage Worlds as like they view encumbrance or resource management. So we're like, this is this thing we don't want to track.
Well, and I'm not going to narrow that to Savage Worlds. Even back when I was playing D&D and other systems, there was quite often every session started with everyone at full health, and every time we would get to a safe place, the GM would just tell us how much we healed through quote unquote rest or whatnot. A lot of gamers hand wave healing. And I think that, there's healing rules there. Use them as you see fit, obviously. But when we start talking about the healing rules and how you apply them, a modern setting versus a future setting versus a historical setting should have an impact on how that works as a GM, depending on, again, how much you're trying to capture that time period. Medicine in the 1860s versus medicine in the 2060s is going to look exceptionally different.
So let's talk about that real quick. Let's say we're running a Civil War era game, and we wanted to talk about abstraction of the state of medicine at that point in time. Let's talk about that. No concept of germs, no concept of sanitary medical practices, clean bandages. Surgeons would not change gloves or smocks, would have blood on their hand from one patient and stick it in another patient, and nobody thought anything about it. So do you increase the penalties to healing rolls? I say no, but what you do is you make the player roll for infection later on if you want to kind of bring that abstraction to it. At the same time, they had this great concept of, hey, here's liquid morphine. Here's a vial of morphine called laudanum. Knock yourself out. Go ahead. We have this great pain reliever.
I was going to say, if you look on page 88 of the core rules, it specifically has medical attention 1940 or earlier, medical attention 1941 or later, and medical attention 2010 and beyond, where it gives you a progressively higher bonus to those rolls based on the era you're receiving care within. So again, if you're wanting closer to realism within Savage Worlds, I would cleave closer to core rules.
Right. And I would say this, especially with
the rules are there for these things.
And I would say, especially if you're having an issue at your table as a GM with murder hoboism, quote unquote, why don't you try applying the healing rules? Like, yeah, you still have -2 from those wounds, and that's going to stick with you for the next 2 sessions.
See, and I go the other direction. If the players want to be murder hobos, let them be murder hobos. But at the same time, I think one of the greatest setting rules I've ever seen that captures the setting and time period properly is Take the Leg from Buccaneer Through Hell and High Water. And I wish Chris was here to kind of congratulate him on that. That is one of the best setting rules there is, where the player can just decide, nah, lop it off and give me a hook. Lop it off and give me a peg leg.
And how does that work? They don't suffer penalties? How does the setting rule work?
I think it bypasses some of the healing penalties. I'd have to look it up again. Like it's a little kind of mini chapter for that particular setting rule that they've put together. But it's this way of, in that time period, if you took a musket ball to the lower shin, they weren't fixing that on a heaving ship. They were grabbing a saw, and you were losing everything below 2 inches below the knee. And it's just the way it worked. And they just put that in there as a setting rule that, these things happen and the character just soldiers on because that's what happens in this setting. it's commonplace.
Okay. Cool.
So again, those are the types of things that I think you have to consider. Just like if you were playing in a far future game, you might be considering things like, you know, the one arm hindrance doesn't really exist because you're just going to have a cybernetic replacement. Or, you know, you're going to have a vat grown replacement that was cloned from your own DNA or whatnot. You know, I think that there's a lot to be said about, you know, having these varying scales and modifiers. But again, you know, you can absolutely conquer that also by simply saying, oh, it's a weird science roll to, you know, to use medical equipment to heal you.
Right. And we talked about this too. It's like in a cybernetic system. If it's like, you know, if you would take a wound naturally that would cause the one arm hindrance, you get a cybernetic replacement. And then if you roll that again, it's just damage until you do the repair roll on it. Right. You suffer the penalty. Yeah. We've had that discussion before.
So let's talk about that for a moment too, is tech. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have a lot of tech that you're going to use in a modern game, whether that's the car, whether it's the cell phone, whether it's the desktop or laptop computer, the tablets, the headsets, you got a Bluetooth headset that's linked up to your cell phone network that lets you talk to your teammate across town while you're trying to organize something. I'm going to start looking at this and going, hey guys, give me a roll, whether it's common knowledge, etc., battery life, preservation, or, you know, you can throw in little things that are an abstract challenge to it, the same way you would throw in the little rolls for things like, you know, whether or not the characters ate their rations or whatnot. You don't necessarily have to come up with, again, another deep clinical system to track these things, but it's very easy to say, okay, well, give me a common knowledge roll to fire the computer up. Oh, look, you failed. It's taken longer than normal to boot up. Looks like maybe something happened with the BIOS. You don't know. It's just going to take twice as long for that piece of equipment to come online, or that program's not working right now. You're not getting a good connection to the internet. Bam, what do your characters do? Because their tech just failed on what is ostensibly, in most cases, going to be a common knowledge roll to use basic tech. And then when you get into more advanced tech, well, then you're starting to talk about what you're doing for your settings. You might have a lot of, you know, high-end spy gear that's all, right, you know, individual like tradecraft rolls or things like that, depending on what you're doing.
Right. And I'm gonna say this too: if you're running a modern setting, in your own setting world, but it's kind of set and trapped against the modern setting, don't be afraid to create a skill like tradecraft, and just say, hey, this covers all tech, high tech equipment. We're gonna call it tradecraft. It's linked to smarts, and this is a skill you can buy.
That is absolutely. If you look at Agents of Oblivion, they have tradecraft for spy work, and they have tech ops for utilizing technology.
Mm-hmm.
Art Fernandez asks, what about magic in a modern game? And well, magic is magic. It follows all the same rules. With that said, a couple things to keep in mind that we've talked about on the show before, if you're including magic in a modern setting, is what technology doesn't exist because it doesn't need to exist. If magic does something and has been doing something in the world for a while, we wouldn't have built tech to do it. So you don't have the quote-unquote hoverboard where it's a board that rests on a single wheel that you rock a little bit to roll around, if you can just have a magical skateboard that actually hovers because of the fly power. So you know, keep in mind what adding magic to the setting changes and where your technological things are going to be, you know, replaced by magical things that become commonplace. But at the same time, magic is just magic. It doesn't matter if it's in a modern setting.
All right. You can get it more into that with your cyberpunk kind of stuff. It's just use basically weird science devices. Give everything 20 power points if it's got some kind of special use for power. But I would say limit it to like 1 power piece of tech. So if your character has a cybernetic eye. It gives them the far sight power, and it has 20 power points. And they just roll a notice check to do $6 million man it across town or whatever.
See, and I think that fits more in the high tech area than magic. I think magic is more, if you've got a guy who actually pulls out a magic wand and can use it, well, what are the ramifications on that? What's the narrative around that? ETU handles this by saying, magic's really, really freaking rare. No one knows about it. It's a hidden part of the world. And, it takes multiple people to cast a single power. Whereas by comparison, something like, if you were running a version of Bright,
or Dresden, because Art brought up Dresden. So let's talk about that. Let's roll that in.
So Dresden, you got a mythical creature that exists, and it's a vampire and gets to do magical shit. Well, then it's a vampire and gets to do magical shit. I mean, I don't need a special rule because it's doing magical shit in modern day to encapsulate magical shit.
You have to realize, though, in Dresden, you don't have a bunch of wizards openly running around unless you count Harry. And that's why he's on everybody's hit list, is because he's out as a wizard. Like you have this whole thing of like, well, people tend to come at you with pitchforks and stakes and torches whenever you do wild and crazy things. And plus, magic, if we're going by basic fiction rules, will always have a cost in some capacity. You're either breaking down some barrier between another world, you're either draining someone of vitality. That's getting into fantasy and horror there, but magic is something that just isn't normally free. And that would be one of the major limiting factors that would allow it to be in a modern game, is the fact that, you have to choose between losing a month of your life or paying $20 for a gallon or a full tank of gas. Which one are you going to do?
Definitely lose a month of your life. It's just faster and easier. Because, what you're losing are the bad years at the end. So that's a no-brainer. That's what you call a no-brainer right there.
Right.
I think, again, the more interesting questions with a modern era and magic are going to be narrative. I don't think it's going to be a mechanics question. Right. I don't think magic is going to need new rules simply because it's set alongside cars and jet planes and machine guns. With that said, again, I think there's going to be, how rare is it? Is it something that, only a few people has? Is it something that's highly, policed by government? We had an entire episode, a month or so back where we talked about this, and we actually got a lot of crap in the comments that we were overcomplicating it. But the end result really is these are choices you make as a GM when you're creating the setting you're going to play in. And once those choices are made, you just stand by them. And it really is more important to have a narrative feel for how that's going to work in your setting rather than any kind of a special mechanic, because it's modern day.
Right. Well, it really kind of breaks down to our previous discussion on urban fantasy when you start rolling magic into a modern setting too. I mean, but no, I agree. It doesn't. The rules don't change just because it's modern setting. They take a look at Deadlands. Weird science is still weird science. Magic is still magic. Miracles is still miracles. It's just the way it's narratively trapped and the way it exists in that world. So,
I will say this: if you're going to add magic to the modern setting, don't wimp out and only add psionics, unless you are specifically trying to capture a psionic only setting. There is this thing that just happened in the 80s where it was decided that magic happened in long ago fantasy, and magic in the future was always psionics or superpowers, and never the twain shall meet. You're not allowed to use wands in the future, and you're not allowed to use psionics in the past. It's like, Jesus Christ, people. don't narrow yourself and give yourself constraints on what you can let your imagination do in these games. It's bullshit and it's bad for you. Get out of the 80s mentality that wrote those rules, break free and do something that's fun.
Right. Doctor Strange was groundbreaking for its time because it went, nope, it's magic. Not psionics, not superpowers. It's magic, bitches. Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else we kind of want to talk about in a modern setting that as a GM you kind of want to have a heads up on.
I want to touch on Alec Muzzy's comment here at the tail end of the magic discussion. He goes, cameras everywhere and not a place to hide the evidence of the supernatural. That's simple. If you want to run a Dresden game or you want to run something of that nature in the modern setting, but you don't want, you can't explain away why it is cameras don't capture that shit. Explain it with the simple veil theory. The human mind does not see what it doesn't want to see. So a camera that takes a picture of a cyclops looks like a man with two eyes when you're looking at that picture because you're not willing to admit that that's a man with one eye and he's a cyclops.
If we're talking about like the actual Dresden Files, using magic will destroy the technology around it. Like,
see, I don't know Dresden's. I can't answer specifically for that setting, but that's why I was kind of more generalized. There's a lot of different ways to handle that.
It's like one of the big reasons why wizards are confined to not use their power, they're told not to use their power, is it's sort of like lightning. It's like lightning hits whatever a wizard is using. Wizards can't even drive cars. They have to either just walk wherever they go or summon some kind of exotic mount. But you can't use your powers like that. You just start destroying everything.
So wait, you're saying that the concept is you have a magical EMF, electromagnetic field that just fucks with technology and destroys it.
Exactly in the Dresden world. If you are a wizard, you will start destroying the technology around you.
Awesome. So if you're a wizard, you own a car. The third time you go to start it up, the battery's just dead. It's drained.
Right? Your car can the battery can just blow up. It's pretty dangerous. I mean, there's a reason why those guys have like those long beards. They don't buy the electric razors.
Right. Well, I mean, if that's what you're trying to accomplish, I would just grab anti-technology aura out of ETU. I mean, every time you touch a piece of tech, there's just a chance that it just breaks. I mean, that's a quick, dirty way to how to join those two things together. Again, though, I would say be careful that you don't say, well, that's the only way this could work. It could also be that it doesn't show up on cameras. It could also be that the mind doesn't pick it up. There could also be the veil thing where it looks like you pulled out a gun and shot instead of holding a wand. The werewolf just looks like a guy with a knife instead of claws, and right. And whatnot. There's a lot of ways to handle that you can decide on and be creative. Come up with some shit that I didn't tell you that you could do that just makes sense to you and your players, that sounds interesting and fun for your setting.
Right. Or you could just go with you can twist some tropes too, right? So vampires don't cast a reflection. Oh, but you can absolutely take a photo of them.
So here's something. You can have the legend that vampires don't cast a reflection, but if you know your lore, it's because they use silver to back the mirrors. Modern vampires would cast a reflection, and that's one of the things that the vampire characters can use against the players.
Yeah. Take a deeper dive when you're looking into some of these things to come up with, well, why was that? Vampires couldn't cross running water. Well, then they can't go anywhere in a modern city because there's fucking pipes every goddamn where. Yep. So you need to come up with, do those pipes insulate it? Is it specifically that they can't cross naturally running water but pumped water? You can take a step back and try to figure out, maybe it's they couldn't cross running water was really because it's all coming down from this natural spring up here that's holy, and therefore all the rivers in that area could be crossed. But they absolutely could cross all the other water in the world. You can take a step back from what it is you're trying to achieve and figure out why is it that way and what impact does that have on the wider game. But again, these are those complex things that as a GM you're deciding before session 0.
Right.
I cannot stress this enough. These are world building questions that you really need to decide before you ever let players encounter the game.
Right. So there's some sense of consistency in your world too. So you could take the whole "they live" concept from the 1980s and go, "Oh no, there's aliens everywhere," and "Oh my God, it's horrible subliminal messages." But if you have these special glasses, then you can see the truth. And how do you explain it? It just is. How does it work? No one knows. It's alien tech. It just is. That's just how it works.
The Men in Black, the little alien riding around in a robot suit that looks like a man, or the big ass freaking bug that crushed itself down and it's walking around in an Edgar suit, and he looks slightly wrong. But
or what if the reason why those glasses exist is so that the humans can actually work on the equipment for their alien overlords? Because some of those humans did work with the aliens.
All right. Yeah. However you want to explain it, but you need to know what your explanation is, and it needs to make sense to you for your world when you do it.
And it needs to be internally consistent to the world. It doesn't have to be consistent with the real world. It needs to be internally consistent to your world.
Yep. So like that could be you take the whole Vampire the Masquerade published by White Wolf and go, there's a full world building setting about a modern setting with vampires and how that whole thing works and why nobody knows they're vampires and blah, 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 blah. A stake through the heart. Does it kill them? No, it incapacitates them. They're like, oh, I can't move, but it doesn't kill them. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, they can't actually eat, but some of them can because it's an illusion to throw you off. So, you can just sort of dive deep. If you want to talk about world building concepts that twist the whole vampire mythos, go read some of that stuff for inspiration.
Yeah, there is a couple of great books that have been released by, I know Wiggy released one for the World Builders Toolkit a while back. There's a lot of world building information out there that answers a lot of these questions that go a lot further than anything we could tell you. But again, this is what happens when you decide to create your own world whole cloth. More what this episode, I think, was about was, okay, so I'm going to run ETU, or I'm going to run, Cthulhu in Modern Times, or I'm going to run, Agents of Oblivion. I'm going to run the new thing coming from Just Insert Imagination, that he's doing. If you're going to run those in a modern setting, the hurdles for that are the stuff we've already talked about.
Or it could just be you're going to run a bank heist. You're just going to run a simple bank heist one shot. You got to have to kind of think these things through before you
Crime
sit down
City
to play.
from the core books, the couple of different Crime City one shots they've released are great games to really encapsulate some different things you have to realize about a modern game. I remember running that kind of for the first time for our core group. And even Jared underestimated some aspects of Savage Worlds because he hadn't played in a modern game. And he took a character that was armed with a baseball bat because it just seemed like the thing to do. And then realized he was being shot at by a guy with an AK-47, and there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it.
Yeah, here's the thing that'll shock you in your players if you're used to playing a medieval or fantasy or whatever. Go ahead and have an NPC hit him with an AK-47 on full auto. Yeah. Here's the one thing you learn with Savage Worlds: you apply wounds as they happen. And somebody hits you with a 3-burst shot and gets 3 shots on your ass. There's the first damage roll. Ooh, 2 wounds. You gonna soak? Yeah, I guess I'm gonna soak. Okay. Oh, I'm down to 1 wound. Okay, here comes the second volley. Oh, look at that, 3 wounds. Fuck.
Oh wait, you didn't soak all of it, so you were shaken. It's easier for that second set that hit you to actually cause a wound.
Yeah, you realize how deadly full auto is to a body in a game on just a 2d8. It's amazing.
Or a rifle with the drop.
Oh God!
Whew, all of a sudden, you find yourself every time your character moves, you're looking for cover.
Yeah, things you just don't think about if you're used to playing. Oh, I'm gonna hack it with a sword. Your gameplay dramatically changes when you step into a modern world with semi-automatic and automatic firearms.
Yeah, and again, if you want a taste of what this is like, and you haven't done this world building, there's the other one, the space one. I can't think of what it's called. Where you have to go onto the disabled shuttle.
USS Kane.
Yeah.
Savage Tales in the core rule book.
Yeah, that's another great one. That's relatively speaking, that's the 15 minutes in the future modern, because it doesn't give you laser pistols or anything.
I ran a one shot of the SS Kane, and I had a bunch of guys that wanted to go on the outside of the ship, and they wanted to drill into the ship to kill anybody in the engine room.
Oh, I mean, first of all, that's great.
That's dastardly.
They were
a great group of players, but at the same time, like, okay, but you're supposed to be rescuing people. There's going to be charges for this, guys.
I was just like, yeah, and so we got into this debate, and literally there were 5 people telling me that in a maritime situation, it is okay to murder the crew.
No! Oh my God, that's great.
I want to tell you, I had some trouble sleeping that night, and it wasn't because of the coffee.
Who is your friend when your players start quoting laws to you that don't exist?
And it wasn't like it was just one of them. There were 5 people telling me, yes, you can do that. And I'm like, no.
Not even in the age of sail or piracy was that okay.
It never was going to be okay.
Wow.
They're
hashtag murder hobo.
One of them was actually in the Navy, and I was like, what the heck, man? This is why they kicked you out.
Hashtag first world GM problems.
I felt like I was running it in Arkham Asylum. I was like, oh. They all died. Yep, they died. They ended up blowing up the ship. I said, okay, well, congratulations. You actually drill right into the engine core, and boom, you are now floating through the cold death of space.
Awesome.
Just as an aside, I know we don't do the pimp it as much anymore, but I do want to mention that if you are a gamer who's looking for a lot of dice, Easy Roller's doing a great deal right now. It's 1 pound of random dice. These are not sets. It's just a pound of random dice. And I want to say it's under $15. So yep. It's a great deal. If you're on their mailing list, you probably already know about it. But yeah, I picked up a couple. Again, this kind of feeds into topics we've talked about recently. You have more dice to carry to cons, or when I'm playing with kids and stuff like that, where I can just kind of hand out a set of dice to whoever needs them.
Yeah, it's kind of like a gift bag. Here you go. Take the dice with you. I hope you enjoyed the game.
Yeah. It's absolutely one of those things that I'll every once in a while as a GM I make sure to pick up these little deals when they come out, because god damn, I go through dice so fast sometimes. Oh, these are great. I'm going to take these home. Hey, what happened to all the dice people borrowed tonight? Awesome. Never let anyone borrow a set of dice you care about.
All right. So do we have anything else in the chat that we want to discuss that wasn't discussed? Any topics we left unmolested? Yeah, I think we're all good.
Yeah.
So on that note, Until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Dave the Rules Maven Scott and Dustin the Savage Zealot Smith saying keep rolling and stay savage.